So it's really a pleasure to have Dr. Robert Harrington here with us. Yesterday evening he had a tough drive in from Newark through torrential rain, but he made it to a really wonderful, well-attended dinner with a lot of fellows and trainees and young faculty that I think was, I think gave people a small taste of why I've called him a friend and colleague and mentor for so many years. Today he's going to teach us, hopefully, a little bit about where the field is going as regards to how to integrate digital health within academic health centers to enhance our ability to investigate and move our field forward. Just a few words about Bob before we get started. And it's very hard to encapsulate the impact that Bob has had on many of us here, as well as on the field in general. But just if you give me a moment to just kind of highlight some of the main pieces. Dr. Harrington trained at Tufts Medical School. Before that, he was a well-trained Holy Cross graduate. He is from New England, and so he still roots heavily for the Boston Red Sox. In fact, going to many games, I know still. And went and did his chief residency after a residency at the University of Massachusetts, and then went off to Duke, where he spent 23 years, initially as a cardiology general fellow and then an interventional fellow. Bob arrived at Duke at a point when I think things were heating up as it relates to clinical medicine, clinical cardiovascular medicine, was really instrumental in the development and the implementation, perhaps more importantly, of the TAMI program and TAMI trials that was that and the TIMI programs were sometimes in competition, but sometimes collaboratively, what moved our field forward along with international collaborators in enhancing our evidence for PCI practice and ACS practice. I always highlight the first paper in trying to think of how the arc of people's careers. Dr. Harrington wrote his first paper as a faculty member, if I think I got it right, in 1994 on the impact of thrombocytopenia in PCI from the TAMI program. I want to say that because he's written 640 papers after that in 24 years. And for the fellows in there, it's really important to recognize that it's starting a little later, but with a focus on enhancing your impact is still very possible, even when you are starting academic medicine in terms of its productivity a little later in your career. So you don't have to come into the fellowship with 20 papers to do remarkable things. Bob has been, moved through ranks at Duke and actually was an endowed professor and led the Duke Clinical Research Institute during, I think, its golden era. In that role, he, and over those 15 to 20 years, he arguably had a remarkable impact on our field, from the 4P trials that established glycoprotein 2B3 inhibition in PCI and ACS, to the many international collaborations and antithrombotic therapies that he created. Really a remarkable impact. And then most recently has moved to Stanford, where he's the Arthur Bloomfield professor. He currently has had an impact also along our national societies. He's been a member 3 times of the FDA Cardiovascular Renal Advisory Committee, twice chairing it, and just finished chairing it just this past year. He's the current president of the American Heart Association, and has been is the master of the American College of Cardiology for his many roles in support of that organization. So he's touched our lives in many different ways. I guess I would just leave you with a few more comments around how he's touched me personally. I mean, I think when you look at at what Bob represents, it's principles in action. And I think through the development of collaborations, it's not the amount of papers, but the impact of those papers and the impact of the collaborations and the teams that he's built and the people he's touched along the way. And so with that, I'd like to introduce Bob to give us this wonderful lecture.
Eric, thank you very much. It's certainly humbling honor to be here at Yale to talk about randomized trials in a digital age. Almost all my relationships are research relationships. And what I'm going to try to do over the course of the next 45 minutes or so is to talk about this notion of how do we transform clinical trials? How do we transform clinical trials now that we have a whole set of tools available to us which we didn't have previously? And so I'll talk a little bit about the notion of the progress that we've made in clinical trials as a method to answer clinical questions, the limitations with trials as we currently perform them, and then I'll try to bring to the story the role that, of digital technologies and what I'll call aiding and transformer randomized trials to make them bigger, faster, cheaper, but certainly different. And we'll talk about a lot of the different roles that digital technologies can play in hypothesis generation, in recruitment, engagement, data collection, endpoints, and even the dissemination of your results, which gives us a much broader reach than strictly being in the peer review literature. A lot of the examples that I'm going to give are examples that our group or groups on campus are currently working on, but they're meant as representative examples, not to be an example of the only thing going on in that field. So what's the need for evidence coming from clinical trials? I would say that largely or broadly defined there are two. There are demands for evidence for the actual practice of clinical medicine, and there's demands for evidence to guide health policy. For clinical medicine, we know from work that's been done over the years that guideline-directed care is associated with improvements in quality and outcomes. And our group was one of the first to show this years ago, making the link between the quality of care in acute coronary syndrome patients and their ultimate outcomes. We also know today that increasingly physician compensation, physician incentive is being tied to quality. And so it's critically important that if we're going to be held in a really accountable way for what we do in clinical practice, we want to make sure that there's an evidence base which is substantive that supports that. Certainly within the realm of evidence to guide health policy, this is how medical products get approved in this country, reimbursement policy is set, and then there's an emerging field of comparative effectiveness research. Well, why does this matter? And many of you will note the slide that you probably haven't used in 25, 30 years from the CAST trial. And I always use this as an example of why clinical trials matter, because it was during my fellowship at the Duke Data Bank that the CAST results were first presented. And what the CAST results were is that you can have a great hypothesis that people who have PVCs, post-myocardial infarction, are at an increased risk of death. And you can have a great hypothesis that people that certain drugs can abolish those PVCs. And you can have a hypothesis that was not yet tested that abolishing those PVCs with the drug would improve patient outcomes. And in fact, that link of a series of sentences led to the approval of a group of antiarrhythmic agents in this country. But there were a group of investigators who said, well, that's insufficient evidence. And they convinced the NHLBI to fund the CAST trial. And in fact, they did find that there was an effect on mortality of the class 1 antiarrhythmic agents, but unfortunately, it went the other direction. And so this is a reminder that no matter how elegant the biologic hypothesis is, that until we really understand it in intact human beings or intact populations, we don't actually know for certain if that hypothesis that we think is correct biologically actually plays out clinically. And this particular concept is an important one as we think about the vast amounts of data that we now have available to look at clinical questions, the so-called concept of big data and how we can take advantage of large data sets to answer clinical questions. And I would just remind us that when we're thinking about clinical comparisons, A versus B, whether that's a drug versus a drug or drug versus placebo, a device versus another strategy of care, we really need randomization if we're going to compare A versus B. And this is just one of many examples I could have taken from cardiology that shows that even very potent observational effects, in this case from the Nurses' Health Study looking at the benefits of cardiovascular disease with vitamin E, when studied actually in a randomized clinical trial, there was absolutely no benefit of vitamin E. And I could give you a dozen of these examples. And one of my favorite quotes comes from a biostatistician that says almost any finding on a treatment comparison in the observational literature is likely to be wrong. And now that's a bit provocative, that there's important things that we learn from the observational literature. Most of my publications are observations as opposed to the randomized comparison. But you need to be careful about what you're using the observational data for. When you're trying to compare something, randomization is still critical. And I like this viewpoint from Greg Fonarow, who said, randomization, there is no substitute. Now, if we think back, and if I think back what I've been doing over the last almost 30 years in the field of clinical trials, it was really the GC investigators from Italy and the ISIS investigators from the UK that changed the field. Mike Lauer at NHLBI, who I borrowed the next couple of from this slide from, points out that this was a disruptive technology. And it was disruptive because for the first time somebody said, most of what we do in clinical medicine and cardiology has incremental benefits to be gained. The way to understand incremental benefits is to use large sample sizes. And the way to understand if it will actually benefit people in clinical practice is to actually study it in clinical practice. And so the GC studies, the ISIS studies, were critically important in opening up the horizon of what's possible with large-scale collaborations and trying to understand if something works in clinical practice. The problem then over the last 30 years is highlighted on this cartoon. And I've certainly been involved in a few of these trials, randomized double-blind trials involving over 20,000 patients, conducted over 10 years, and unfortunately we've forgotten why. And so in many ways the large simple trial became the large complicated trial. And so why was that? Well, let me give you, I will mostly only pick on things that we've been involved with. And so I'll pick on a trial that I was involved with called Improve It when I was still at the Duke Clinical Research Institute. Here was the rationale and the question. Lowering LDL with statins among patients with known coronary disease improves clinical outcome. We knew that. Lowering LDL to 70 with a high-intensity statin was better than lowering an LDL to around 100 with a moderate-intensity statin. We knew that from clinical trials. Therefore, the simple question was, if you added ezetimibe, another way of lowering LDL cholesterol, to a statin, and you got additional LDL lowering from 70 down to around 50, would you get additional incremental clinical benefit? Okay, seems pretty straightforward. How long could that possibly take you? It took us 10 years. And it took us 10 years because there was a huge amount of work in this large clinical trial. That part of it was the fault of the investigators, meaning those of us who were leading the trial. Part of it was the regulatory environment in which we were operating. Part of it was dealing with a large pharmaceutical sponsor who had certain ways that they wanted to see things done. But look at the amount of work that went into this to just really understand, when you added ezetimibe to a statin, was that beneficial? And remember, the whole time that we were doing this study, ezetimibe was on the market. And so we had a drug on the market that we didn't truly know if it worked for the benefit of patients. And it took us 10 years to prove that it did work. It worked in a very modest way, as would have been predicted from everything we knew about LDL cholesterol lowering. But it took 10 years of work, and that's really not acceptable. And so several years ago, Elliot Antman and I wrote this viewpoint in JAMA, where we said that as large trials became popular, simplicity was lost, and it led to increasingly complex trials. And the unintended consequence there was to really threaten the very existence of RCTs, given all the complexities. An ideal opportunity, we propose, would be to embed randomization in the EMR, including randomization into registries sponsored by societies. So we thought that as we began to have more data available to the world, how could we not abandon the concept of large-scale randomized trials, but how could we do them better? And after Elliot and I wrote that, a number of papers came out that began to talk about the shift in the landscape away from the development of cardiovascular drugs, because it was felt that developing cardiovascular drugs was too complicated. It was easier, and as you see in this paper from a couple of venture capitalists in the Menlo Park area, right in the New England Journal, that many drugs designed for orphan diseases and cancers are good investments of scarce capital, since they tend to have relatively low development costs and to be strongly differentiated from the current treatment options. So what we're basically selling here is that the money's not going to follow cardiovascular medicine. It's going to follow oncology and rare diseases. And in fact, you see that. You see that with the number of products in development really declining over time. And so a challenge here for those of us interested in cardiovascular medicine is not just the basic biology to identify new targets, new potential approaches, but really to think about how can we study things more efficiently in a way that the cardiovascular community really wants, and that is a demonstration on improvement in clinical outcomes in a way to make the field continue to move forward. Well, obviously, a lot of people are thinking about this. I think one of the loudest voices at NIH has been Mike Lauer. And Mike has put forward this review about 1.5 years ago now in Nature Cardiology, where he talks about the efficient design of clinical trials. Is it possible? And I don't want you to look at the details here. I want you to pull out the paper. But what I want you to look at least at the list to understand there's a lot of different opportunities here to improve clinical trials. And this is a partial listing of all the problems that we have with clinical research. And then they propose some potential solutions to think about. Simplifying the protocol, standardizing interoperable data formats. That piece is particularly important as we get into the digital conversation. Leveraging digital platforms, including pre-existing data. Why is it that we have clinical practice going on over here, clinical research going off over here, and never the two shall meet? It's been very difficult over the years to integrate those two. Now, with access to wide-scale electronic health records around the globe and a variety of ways to capture data, why can't we do that more efficiently? And this, I think, is fundamentally why we can now do things differently in clinical research. And when The Economist, which has its ear to the ground, really does pick up the big societal trends, these were 2 cover stories in the last decade about the whole concept of data. One was called The Data Deluge, and how every industry on the globe was going to be faced with this notion of what to do with all of this data. And then more recently, this cover story, which talked about the concept that oil was no longer the world's most valuable resource. Data was the world's most valuable resource. And how were we going to think about this ubiquitous nature of data, but also use it in a way that was thoughtful and careful as we think about how to apply it to problems of human health. And so what digital starts to give us is an opportunity to take advantage of how we get to that data, how we move that data, how we put that data together, and potentially how we analyze and disseminate that data at speeds that we've never been able, and scales that we've never been able to do before. So in a paper we wrote in JAMA Cardiology a couple of years ago, we tried to describe broadly what digital health means. And so you'll see that as I go through the presentation, I will use very, very broad definitions of digital health, which will include, as we said, amongst other things, mobile health, wireless, connected health, big data, wearable sensors, telemedicine, precision medicine. We're going to take the term very broadly, and I'll give you a number of examples of ways that we think about doing things in the digital health space. Now, this has also been an area that's really exploding. One of our residents recently published a letter in JAMA Internal Medicine looking at how much digital health research is actually out there in clinicaltrials.gov, and there's a fair bit of it. If you look at clinicaltrials.gov until the end of about 2018, there's over 2,000 digital health studies. Now, that's either studying a digital device or is one of the interventions, or has digital technology embedded into the clinical trial in a very important way, for example, in which to collect information. And they're predominantly in the adult space, although there are some in the pediatric space. Not surprisingly, particularly because of the sensor technology, a lot of the clinical trials are in cardiovascular medicine. A lot of them are in behavioral health. But here's part of the challenge, is that most of them are quite small. So most of them you would regard as trials that might provide some insight into a condition, but very few of them are going to provide clinical outcome data. And even the ones that have been going on a while have struggled to really finish. And so we can see that of the only 13% of the ones started before 25 are actually marked in clinicaltrials.gov as completed. So we have a problem, we have a set of technology tools, and we have another problem, which has been how do you apply this to actually answer questions? So again, there's a variety of ways to think about this. And at a think tank a few years ago, we put forward this paper about how to use technology to generate better evidence and deliver better evidence-based care. And we begin to think about the various components of how we both interact with patients in the clinical setting, but also interact with patients in the research setting, and say, how can we think about these digital technologies in the context of those various settings to improve the system? And one of the most obvious places to think about in terms of interacting, capturing, getting information from people is using our smartphones. It's extraordinary. This actually crosses many, not all, but maybe most socioeconomic lines. That almost 80% of us now own a smartphone. And very similar figures if you go around the globe, a high proportion of the population own a smartphone. They may not have access otherwise to the internet, not in a laptop or a tablet or a standalone computer, but many of us across the globe do own a smartphone. And so what might you think about when you have a smartphone in terms of your possibilities of doing research? Well, led by Mike McConnell and you and Ashley, we're involved in a project with Apple that's called My Heart Counts. In this, we're using the Apple iResearch Kit as a way of trying to understand, can we get people to engage with us in a meaningful way and allow us to access their health information? And this was the first publication that we put forward on about the first 50,000 subjects that were involved in the project. And one of the things that I think the smartphone and digital gives you is a different way of thinking about the whole patient engagement process. And in this case, in the informed consent process. So we're not using multi-page informed consent. That's available. It's sort of like if you want to see your user agreement with any of the technologies you use, that's what informed consents look like, and we all click agree. But in a clinical trial, we'd actually like to make sure that they understand that. And so we've now worked with a group of ethicists and a group of individuals who are very keen in design to understand what actually is something that people can understand. And so we use a series of screens to potentially walk people in a very visual way through the consenting process. It's very quick. And we also, in an important era of patient empowerment, we give the patient or the subject, depending upon the project, the ability to tell us what data we can and can't have. And even in the course of the project, they can tell us at any time, in any point in time, that they want to no longer give us that piece of data. And they can do it through a method that they're familiar with on their iPhone, and just turn on and off the various ways of us capturing your data. Now, in the first paper that we published in JAMA Cardiology, we put out the first 50 or so thousand patients, and we had pieces of information like the following. 6-minute walk is a common endpoint that we use both in clinical practice to assess cardiopulmonary fitness, as well as in clinical trials to potentially assess the effect of an intervention on 6-minute walk. If you look through the literature, the entire literature on the normative values of 6-minute walk, so through multiple papers, is about 1,500 subjects. Within this data set, we had over 10,000 subjects that gave us 6-minute walk data. And so not only do we have the accelerometer 6-minute walk data, we have all the signals that go into what that means. Is it 6-minute walk where they walk faster at the beginning, slower in the middle, faster at the end? Is it a more continuous walk? And all of that data is now available in a big data sort of way to begin to understand how you might use that. We're now doing randomized trials using the same platform, and the first trial we did was just a very simple proof of concept to try to understand, could we use different methods of nudging people to get them to increase their step count throughout the day. And so we did a randomized comparison of different methodologies, and that paper will be coming out shortly. Well, let's go back to this notion of that's having people give you data that they're collecting now. What about data that already exists? And what about data that's in, everybody's favorite topic, data that's in the EMR? How do you get it out for meaningful purposes of doing research? Well, our friends in Sweden had figured this out a while ago. The Swedes, a country of about 10,000 people, have nationwide registries for a variety, in fact, almost all disease states, but certainly in cardiovascular medicine, they capture the entire cardiovascular portfolio of their country, whether it's acute coronary syndrome care, the pacemaker implantation care, AFib care, they capture it all. And they capture everything from the time somebody enters the Swedish healthcare system until they leave the Swedish healthcare system via a unique number identifier. And what they decided to do in this sort of challenge that Dr. Antman and I rose about, why can't we embed clinical trials into registries? Well, they actually went ahead and did it. And they embedded randomized clinical trial into their nationwide registry of ST elevation primary angioplasty care. And over the course of about 2 years, they captured almost 80% of the eligible patients in the country who were having a myocardial infarction and randomized them at the time they were having their myocardial infarction to either receive thrombus aspiration or not during primary ST segment elevation MI. There had been small data that suggested this was a beneficial activity, and in fact, when they did a large-scale trial in thousands of patients, they demonstrated that on a routine basis, it did not add incremental benefit. And that was an important observation, number one, that you could actually do this. Number two, that you could get a truly generalizable result. 80% of a population is pretty generalizable. And number three, they took on something that was felt to be beneficial on a much smaller body of evidence. Well, if they're a country of 10 million people, we're a country of 330 million people, couldn't we do that too? The challenge with our system is that both the AHA and the ACC registries, as you know, are largely in-hospital based. The more chronic clinical registries like the Pinnacle Registry through the ACC are a little more challenging to link to hospitalization. You can do it, but they're a little more challenging to do that. So what about if we look at these networks that have been formed, largely by COCORI, but also by the FDA through things called like Mini-Sentinel? Can we use that backbone of information coming in through the electronic health records, all that data that we all enter every day? Can we repurpose it for a clinical trial question? Well, PCORI put out an RFP a number of years ago now for pragmatic clinical trials, trials that would utilize the structure of a PCORI-built research network using electronic health records across the country. And could we try to answer clinical trials questions more efficiently? We're involved with one called Adaptable, which is answering that question you've always wanted to know. Is it 81 milligrams of aspirin or 325 milligrams of aspirin that's more beneficial than the other? And the sad reality is here's something we all use multiple times a day, and we don't know. And in fact, if you ask yourself, well, has there never been a randomized comparison? There hasn't. There's indirect evidence that the higher dose might be better in preventing ischemic events, and there's indirect evidence, meaning comparing across trials, that the lower dose is likely safer, but we don't actually know the balance. And in fact, if you look at what the country is doing, there was an analysis done of about 500,000 subjects enrolled in one of the NCDR registries post-myocardial infarction, and we know that about 45% of people after an MI go home on 81, about 45% of patients go home on 325, and 10% go home on a variety of doses that would probably surprise you. But as a country, we couldn't figure out why are people choosing the 81. It was not based on clinical characteristics. It wasn't as though smaller, older people with more comorbidities were in 81. So we thought this was the perfect substrate for clinical equipoise at the community level. And so we're doing this randomized trial. But what's interesting is we're doing the entire thing through the electronic health record and administrative claims data and follow-up in that way. So first off, we identify all of the patients through the electronic health records in this network of sites that belong to PCORnet. And we do this by the creation of something called a computable phenotype, where you tell the computer who you're looking for, what characteristics they have, and the computer goes to find them for you, and then they can be approached for enrollment in a variety of different ways, a lot of which, if not most of which, is electronic. And then all of the follow-up, if you think about all of you who are doing clinical trials at the site, once the enrollment is done, everything moves electronically. And all the work is done electronically, including the ascertainment of events, the adjudication of events, et cetera. And the goal was to enroll 15,000 subjects. And rarely have I been involved in a clinical trial where the accrual curve looks like what you intended it to look like. And that we've enrolled those patients very quickly. In fact, yesterday we were just 600 subjects short of the enrollment. And so we'll have the 15,000 subjects in the next week or two. This is being done, for those of you who do clinical trials, 15,000 subjects at 32 sites. So we have sites who have enrolled thousands of patients at any individual site. And we'll have the results available next spring. So we'll know the answer. And I think a very efficient way to answer an important clinical question. Not quite as efficient as we wanted. It's going to end up taking us about 4 years from concept to really the end of the road here where we release the results. We thought it might take us as little as 2.5, 3 years. But this isn't bad. A lot less than that 10 years that we talked about earlier. But this is not a new concept, how to use data. And I put this in part for my Duke friends who remember Dr. Stead. And Dr. Stead in the 1960s already had the idea that, that you could exploit computer technology to create databases, and that was the genesis of the Duke Databank. And Dr. Stead's idea was that in all disease states, you should be collecting and aggregating data and allow that data to be available in real time for clinicians who have to make decisions. Many years later, we now have the possibility, I think, of fulfilling what I would call Dr. Steads' vision. We wrote this paper in Health Affairs a couple of years ago. It was really a concept paper, and it came out because as I was talking to a group of our informaticians, Chris Longhurst, Nigam Shaw, about why can't we just press a button at the bedside and get aggregated data at the bedside to allow us to make decisions when perhaps guidelines don't exist. And I'd like some more information about the characteristics of my patients, et cetera. And so we wrote this paper for Health Affairs that we called a green button for using aggregated patient data at the point of care. And then the informaticians went away and built it. And then our health system agreed to help us fund it and to put it into play. And so now at Stanford, you can get an informatics consult where you have a question that you'd like to understand. Who are these patients? In fact, if you want to read about it, you can go to greenbutton.stanford.edu. And we just published the first paper on this a couple of weeks ago, Time to Learn from Patients Like Mine. So this is a concept that's been around for a long time, but now we have the digital tools to do it. And what are the data sources that we're looking at? We're looking at millions of patient encounters through the Stanford data, but we're also looking at a variety of other data sets, Medicare data set, Truven, Optum, a variety of data sets that you can ask. And this is really helpful when you have an unusual patient, say with an unusual cancer or an unusual immunologic presentation, that we can begin to understand what's the experience of people like these? What do these patients look like? What's the natural course of history? It's not proving that a certain course of therapy might make a difference, but it's giving the clinician another set of information to inform clinical decision making, and I think also informing a lot of clinical research. We're finding out that some of our young faculty and fellows are beginning to use the tool to be able to generate hypotheses for clinical research in a meaningful sort of way. So another way to use big data in a very quick way, we can actually, the longest period of time it takes in this consult is the time it takes for the clinician to answer the questions about what are they actually trying to get at. And that might take as long as half a day. And then it literally can take us anywhere from seconds to a couple hours, depending upon how complex the coding is, that one of the informaticians quickly does and runs it through a machine learning program that we've developed over the last couple of years. So the next paper that's coming out is the results on the first 120 patients. Other sources of data that now exists in a way that's very different, that allows us, again, in the clinical research realm to do things in a way that we've never done before. We're partnering with our friends at Duke and our colleagues at Verily, which was previously known as Google Life Science, to try to understand, can we collect information in a way that's never been available to us before, and can we then use that information to gain insights into human health? And so in this project called Baseline, we're intending to enroll 5,000 subjects in North Carolina, 5,000 subjects in Northern California. And in fact, if you think about the demographics of the two regional areas, we will come close to mimicking the racial and ethnic characteristics of the United States. And we're doing that very purposefully to try to have balance across the project. And we're bringing people in for, as you can see, what is really a deep dive. So for those of you, again, who do research, is that the first visit of this project takes 16 hours for us to collect the data that's going to be collected. Think about that. So it takes place over 2 days. It's 16 hours. And we're collecting everything in the clinic. We're getting access to electronic health records. We're collecting physiologic measures. We're doing imaging, obviously collecting blood. We're also collecting at home with sleep monitors, voice recognition devices in the house. And we're also collecting patients in real time, utilizing their devices that they carry, that they access portals. And to give you a sense of the scope of this, is that every subject, every visit contributes 6 terabytes worth of data. And those visits are at day 1, and then they'll be followed yearly for a minimum of 5 years. we're trying to understand really several things, one of which is in a cohort of patients with solid organ cancer, and another is in patients with coronary disease, and then a cohort with neither. We're trying to understand the progression of those diseases. We're also trying to understand the progression from risk to disease and utilizing novel markers and the creation of novel markers to try to understand this. Just looking at some of the tools that are available, including from the participant portal. And as I said, every subject, 6 terabytes worth of data, and we're now up to, at Stanford, we've just enrolled our 1,000th patient a couple of weeks ago. And so you're going to see the first reports coming out now that there's about 2,300 subjects with characterizing who these patients are and what's the depth of human biology that we've begun to understand about them. A project that some of you may have seen that was recently presented at the American College of Cardiology is utilizing your watch and your smartphone to begin to understand, I would say, a couple of things. Number one, can you engage at really large scale a group of subjects who will give you consent to collect their health-related data? And then can you use a wearable sensor to detect a biologic phenomenon, in this case, atrial fibrillation? But what the project was really designed for was to understand, could we do this at scale? And could the watch detect, in a very technical feasibility manner, atrial fibrillation? And remembering that it's actually not detecting atrial fibrillation, it's detecting irregularity in the pulse, which with a machine learning algorithm is constantly trying to understand what's the likelihood, what's the probability that that's atrial fibrillation. So you can see here the goals of this project. Here's the part that I'm most interested in, which is the feasibility of doing this. And you can see that over about 8 months, we got over 400,000 subjects to give us consent, download the app, and provide us consent to collect their data. And you might notice, what's that spike in the middle? What did you do to get that big increase? Apple sent out an email to all wearers of the watch who had said that they were interested in participating in research in the future, and that was the immediate response we got, showing that now we have the ability to collaborate with people who have a reach that none of us have, and that's truly extraordinary. All of this data, I was talking about this with Holland Krumholz at dinner last night, all of this data was actually managed at Stanford. Apple wanted none of the data coming through their shop. All the data was managed at Stanford. And at the height of the project, I think we had about a dozen computer scientists and data scientists working on the data flow issues of this massive amount of information coming in continuously to the coordinating center. For those of you wondering about, was this just a bunch of wacky people in Silicon Valley who signed up to do this? The answer is no. We actually, first project I've ever been involved with, we had enrollees in every state. So all 50 states were contributing here. For those of you who are worried about the demise of research in the United States, it was only done in the United States. So all of the enrollment came from the United States, every state. And we had people of various ages, including almost 25,000 above the age of 65. It went very quickly. And look at what we're finding here from the cohort. These are people who, this is not just a bunch of healthy software engineers. There's people with elevated CHA2DS2-VASc score, people with hypertension, diabetes, history of heart failure, pointing out to me that we can get even people who are sick, who have cardiac conditions at scale, get them to give us information and provide it to us in a HIPAA compliant way. Let me talk a little bit about what we're now really interested in terms of what do you then do with all of this data. And the concept that I know that people here are working on, things like artificial intelligence and variants thereof, like machine learning and the development of neural networks. Again, like the Stead quote, not new concepts. Going back at least into the early 60s, there's literature on how does one utilize, they called it computer-aided. This was artificial intelligence-aided analysis of radiographic images. So long time ago, but now we have the ability with large-scale data availability and very, very advanced computational methods that largely can be performed now at scale because of the existence of cloud computing. And so if you've not seen this paper by Eric Topol, it's definitely worth taking a look at, just published a couple of months ago, on what he's called high-performance medicine, the convergence of human and artificial intelligence, and really begins this concept of how do you bring together very, very disparate sources of data and utilize that in a way that's not been done before? Well, he points out that this is a field that's moving really fast. And if you look at different areas of medicine, radiology, path, derm, cardiology, there's a lot that's appearing in the literature. And there's beginning to be products approved by FDA that utilize artificial intelligence guided algorithms to actually help, largely with diagnosis, but soon that'll also be prognosis, maybe effect of treatment, et cetera. And so what you can see here, in a way that we could never do with all of the data sources that we collected through things like Improve It, where we would analyze things by the clinical data, the laboratory data, the imaging data, and then combine it after the fact. What you can actually do now, utilizing different computational methods, is analyze across very disparate sources of data to begin to create new phenotypes, begin to understand diseases better, begin to understand the creation of biomarkers better that might be a source of how we guide our therapies. And so this is actually playing out. This is one of my favorite ones where diagnosing pneumonia better than radiologists. This was 8 Stanford students, 4 graduate students and 4 undergrads who take a course in both artificial intelligence and utilizing electronic health record for medical research. And as part of that course, they need to give 25 hours a week to projects. And so this was their project. And they took a data set that was publicly available of chest x-rays that had been available for about a decade. And in 4 weeks, they created algorithms that allowed them to diagnose, in this case, pneumonia. Now it's progressing. They can diagnose virtually anything on the chest x-ray that's abnormal and begin to categorize it by disease category in just a truly extraordinary way. And one might think about, how do you then put this into the workflow where perhaps 50, 60, 70% of radiographs, chest radiographs, are normal? And if the computer can take those away from the radiology needing to read them, number one, efficiency improved, and number two, radiologists can concentrate on what we really didn't concentrate on, which is the complicated set of images. We're also using this in our new hospital. We're opening a new hospital this fall, and half of our ICU beds in an experiment are going to be outfitted with bedside computer vision, so that we can use bedside computer vision to understand what goes on at the point of care that maybe we can make better. So I'll give you an example, is that during the course of an 8-hour shift in the intensive care unit, a nurse makes approximately 600 or 700 unique movements during the course of that day that relate to patient care, things like turning people in bed, delivering medications, et cetera. Can we understand, using imaging and artificial intelligence, which of those movements really matter? Because no person can get all 600 right every shift, every day. But are there movements that we really care about? We're also beginning to work with surgeons in Intermountain Healthcare to begin to understand what actually makes for a good surgery. Why is it that, that the senior surgeon, what do they do that's different technically than the junior surgeon? And can we understand that? Can we measure it? And then can we teach it so that it's reproducible? So artificial intelligence helping at the bedside. Not surprisingly, in cardiology, looking at the electrocardiogram, there's been artificial intelligence, or lack thereof, in the reading of EKGs for years. And none of us have ever thought those are very good, but they've not been updated in decades. Now the algorithms are really good. And there's even a paper that recently came out about detecting hyperkalemia at a much earlier point in its evolution, utilizing machine learning around the changes in EKG than we've ever been able to do before. So all these tools are there. Most recently, Josh Knowles and Nigam Shah in our group are embarked on a nationwide project of trying to understand, how do you identify people who have familial hypercholesterolemia? Because they're woefully underdiagnosed, as you know, and end up with catastrophic complications of early atherosclerosis. But this might be my favorite set of projects that's going on. Everybody knows what this is? How many of you have one? So when I asked that in California, everybody has one. But so a couple of you have one. Any of you have more than one? I have them in multiple rooms in my house. It's, but just recently, this is the Amazon Alexa. There's also the Google Home. There's other products that are coming out. These are voice recognition devices that utilize then machine learning to provide you with a variety of pieces of information during the day. A lot of it is just fun and silly, but it also can be things like my 3-year-old has a fever, how much acetaminophen do I give them? And in a collaboration with Boston Children's Hospital, they have algorithms that will help you figure that out. They'll ask you how much the baby weighs. Or in my role with the Heart Association, there's a project whereby you can ask Alexa to tell you how to do CPR. So if you've not done CPR and somebody collapses, how do you do that? And so you can also then begin to imagine where's the nearest defibrillator and how do we begin to understand how to do it. So all of that is being done, and now it's being done in a HIPAA secured way. What are we doing it for? This might be my favorite project that the group is working on. Stephen Lin is one of our young family medicine faculty. He's working with the DeepMind group within Google to have embedded Google engineers in 11 primary care clinics in our practice, and is now beginning to understand, can we have an ambient voice recognition device that can take over the process of medical scribing, not just in transcription, but being able to understand the nuance of a clinical discussion, the words you use, the tone of your voice. You couldn't do this as a human being except in the one-on-one situation, but the machine can do it at scale. And so we've just finished the first part of the project, which was about 1.5 years of data collection in these 11 primary care clinics. And beginning to see things like this coming out of, this was not in our practice, but another project that Google's working on, to begin to understand, this was just published a week or two ago, a letter where they begin to talk about the challenges with a machine and listening to the human voice and the dialects and the different ways that, that people talk about clinical conditions are obviously not the same. But this is where the field is going, and think about how we might use this in clinical research. Other areas where people are using unique data sources for the collection of information, people are using Facebook, and spontaneous coronary artery dissection is an unusual form of coronary occlusion and myocardial infarction. It was really a group of SCAD survivors who came together on Facebook who then prodded investigators at Mayo Clinic into actually pursuing some research on this, and their initial registry was actually started in Facebook. People are beginning to use Twitter as a data source, and I'm aware of at least one R01 that somebody is using Twitter and being able to understand public health trends, utilizing a big data machine learning approach of collection of this data. And you can begin to see, well, what could you possibly use that for? Well, people are using it as a complementary data source for pharmacovigilance. People actually tweet about how they're affected with side effects by different drugs or therapeutics. So all of this is possible. And I like to apply it to what I call, what does it actually take to do quality clinical research? And despite the fact that a trial like IMPROVE-IT took us a decade, it really comes down to about 10 simple things. And so now as I begin to think about digital and new ways of doing things, does it meet these criteria for what is a quality clinical trial? And let me close with this. And this is about utilizing the digital world to disseminate your research as well. It's all very well making discoveries and saving lives and improving the world, Roger, but your research is making barely any impact on social media. And I do think that there's a role out there for the use of social media in terms of disseminating your information. It's extraordinary if you look at some of the high-profile people, Mike Gibson, Eric Topol, they have hundreds of thousands of followers who pick up the information that they're putting out there. My view is that we should be putting out there in the cardiology community peer review observations that we can share with each other and perhaps shorten that time that it takes to use things in clinical practice. From now, it's about 17 years from the time it gets approved until the time it's widely accepted. Can we shorten that using social media? Certainly, if you look at the social networking that goes on through social media at things like a medical meeting, this was ESC. Look at the networks that have been where people are sharing information. That's truly extraordinary. I can't wait till technology replaces doctors. Medicine will be so much better once engineers are in charge. That's the view usually from Silicon Valley. But I actually go back to Dr. Stead. Dr. Stead used to have this famous saying that Eric will remember. You would tell him a complicated story, and he would say, you know what this patient needs? This patient needs a doctor. And what he meant is that you needed somebody to stand back and take hold of the situation, think about that. So on our campus, we're thinking about that a lot. We actually have a major initiative called Human Intelligence, Artificial Intelligence. And we wrote this paper in JAMA last year where we took a line from Dr. Stead and said, you know what this computer needs? This computer needs a doctor. And so we got to bring them both together because that's what's going to make things work. And so we can't just give it over to the machines. That's not going to solve the problems of clinical trials and clinical research. We need to bring what we know as human beings and what we know about the human connections, and but utilize the tools that we now have available to us. So I'll thank you for inviting me. I'll thank Eric for many, many years of friendship and your kind words, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Dr. Harrington, thank you so much. This was incredible talk, and for the honor of coming down. So you're now part of the Yale cardiology family. I know you have season tickets to the Red Sox, and I think that you would.
So I can wear my Yale hat now?
Yeah, you really would look very different
Thank you.
in the Boston crowd wearing a Yale hat. So any questions from the crowd?
Yeah, I guess I'll start, but that was tremendous and you're really terrific talk and inspiring in so many ways. We have so much to do together, really, to move this field forward. Yesterday in the Wall Street Journal, there was an article about cyber attacks, and Harlan and I were talking about this a little yesterday, I think a little bit, about how there is concerns that have been raised by healthcare systems around the utilization of information as a means to do malicious issues. And I guess the question is, I'm a half glass full kind of guy, so I think we need to pursue this. But how do you integrate vigilance around those concerns, particularly in a very well-connected world where not every society shares our values?
Yeah, so the cybersecurity issue is a major one when you're working in this space, and certainly the companies out our way, including Google and Facebook, have come under widespread. In fact, Zuckerberg was in France earlier in the weekend to talk with the French government about the challenges of cybersecurity and whether or not that meant they needed to have tighter regulation, et cetera. I do think we need to update the regulations around how we think about this kind of data, which flows really quickly. And you have to take, if I think in our own place, the type of security we have around these projects, it's extraordinary. But not every place can have that. And so how do we provide a level of security that ensures that protected health information is going to be just that, protected? I think it's steps, Eric, like working with the vendors that are going to the extra steps to do that. Amazon in the cloud and Google in the cloud are certainly doing that, and making sure that you don't take lightly those concerns and let just people put things on a server and run projects through a server. We do that on our campus in a really secure environment, largely through cloud-based activities that are managed by people with really high level of security that has an extra layer of security from us. The big one in the healthcare system that's problematic right now is people holding healthcare systems ransom for Bitcoin, where they're shutting down a small hospital and saying, we won't open up your hospital unless you give us $50,000. And guess what? People are paying it because they can't keep their hospital dormant for 2-3 days while they wait. So big issues to figure out.
But with regard to the security, IBM's got 200 million electronic health records. Flatiron takes all of our Smilo data every day out of it. This gets a lot of publicity, but the health system's already sending electronic health records to commercial companies every day. All the Smilo data every day gets shipped to Flatiron. And we pay them $50,000 to take our data, and then they produce a quality report, but then
who remember is now owned by Roche.
So
Roche acquired them for $2 billion.
So all the business associate agreements. I think we focus on the digital health companies, but the truth is that the health systems are actually, through business associate agreements, sending around electronic health records to all sorts of commercial interests all the time. That's hence the bigger problem of what do we think about privacy and security with regard to health information
As a society.
Yeah.
Yeah, I agree with you, Harlan.
Thank you for a wonderful talk. A couple of thoughts about randomized clinical trials, which have bothered me for a number of years. Basically, under the influence of Ralph Horowitz and also Harlan over the years, I've had concerns. And Ralph published a wonderful paper where he showed that adherence to protocol yielded as good results, whether it was placebo or active agent, as you had when you were just comparing the two routinely. And if we don't have a system where randomization is a societal norm as they do in Sweden, you're going to, I've had problems getting my patients in trials for years. They won't participate. It's one thing to wear a watch to see if you have AF. It's another thing to flip a coin for surgery versus a stent. And those are really big differences. And I think the patients that enter these trials are substantially different than the populations that many of us care for. And the other issue with RCTs comes up with exportability of the data based upon those exclusion criteria that we have. So how do we deal with this with RCTs in the future?
Yeah, so a great set of questions that deal with a lot of the issues that people have talked about in RCTs over the year. And I would say that to the first comment about what is it about clinical practice versus the clinical trials that might not be the same. And that's one of the reasons that the large-scale trial like GC and ISIS really came on the scene, was to try to say, if we're going to have all the messiness of clinical practice, and we're going to have a patient population that looks like the patients we take care of every day, then you have to enroll a large sample size that looks like the patients we care for every day. You have to do very little to interfere with their process of care other than the randomized treatment assignment, and then you see what happens to them. And that's why my comment that you mostly in that situation are now seeing incremental treatment effects, right? The benefit of TPA versus streptokinase was 1%, and took 40,000 patients to understand that. And the question of adherence makes really clear this notion of when there isn't a standard of care, placebo-controlled trials are really important because of that adherence issues. And then, because only then, if you have a placebo, can you understand what's the incremental value of having added the new therapy. And it's particularly important in those situations to be blinded because of the adherence issues. So yeah, there's all of these standard issues that we've talked about in randomized trials for a year, which are legitimate criticisms of the process. Leap forward to now being able to do things at scale. I actually think that for common conditions, the trials that we need to see have to be exponentially larger than the trials we're currently doing for many of the reasons that you've said, so that we don't interfere with clinical care. We allow clinical care and all its messiness to sort of happen. We get patients that look like the patients that we're going to treat every day. That's going to require a major societal change in how we think about the concept of randomization. There's a group at Hopkins at the Hastings Center that are writing a lot about this these days, about rethinking the notion of informed consent. Why is it that we let doctors do whatever they want to do based on choice that they make, based on some data, no data, experience, et cetera, and we don't study it in a rigorous sort of way? If we really don't know what the answer is, and you know this, Dr. Zara, is that in cardiovascular medicine, which is heavy on evidence, only about 25% of the guideline recommendations are class 1. Only about 25%. So that means the vast majority of what we're doing, we're making decisions. We're uncertain about it. Why aren't we constantly studying that? The way that technology's developed, they do randomized trials all the time with so-called A/B testing. There's an interesting paper that appeared just a couple days ago that said that it was done by a group of computer scientists that say that A/B testing works well with machines, because we constantly are doing that to develop machines. But when you get into an area where a very high level of education is required to enter the field, they're less accepting of randomization because they think they know what's the right answer. And so we have to change the way we as doctors think and are trained, and we have to change the way societal thinks about things like informed consent. So a lot of interesting work in the ethics area for this. Yeah.
I just wanted to get back to what you said about Eric's football's 100,000 Twitter followers. I think that's really nice, because Gwyneth Paltrow, anti-vax,
Also has a lot.
yeah, probably 3 million.
Yeah.
And she's winning. And my question is, how can just getting the message, just putting the correct information out there doesn't seem to be enough. And so I'm wondering, what are your thoughts about how to get the information, the correct information, out in ways that are heard?
So the anti-vaxxer one is an interesting one, because you may have seen there's a series of articles this week in the lay press about anti-vaxxers going after doctors who speak against them and utilizing social media against them by going to the physician rating sites and overwhelming their rating sites with bad reviews. So there was a doctor in Boston. She was a very public proponent of vaccination, and she gets a call from a friend who says, I tried to refer someone to you, and they said they wouldn't see you because your online reviews were so bad. And it turned out she'd had something like 1,000 reviews in 3 months that said she was a horrible human being, didn't care about her patients, et cetera. So what you're describing is real, not just in the sense that any opinion, it's the democratization of information, right? It gets out there. I would actually say, what I say is that that means those of us who have knowledge about science and are credible, we need to be out there as voices to combat some of this stuff. And we have to be willing to take a stand. And we have to be willing to talk about things in a public way. This is going to be an information battle in the next generation. This whole concept of fake news, alternative facts, it's playing out in real life out there around things that you care a lot about, including things that affect the care of your patient. I would say that we as a community have to be better organized and be out there. I'm giving our State of the Department address when I go back on later this week, and we looked at we now have a full third of our Department of Medicine faculty have active Twitter presence and are beginning, and we make it, we have a running Twitter board in the office suite where people can walk by and see what our faculty are talking about. So we're using it as another tool to begin to disseminate information from learned individuals. So I would say get out there if you're not, and take them on.
Last question,
Yeah.
Real quick. I think you comment on the use of digital platforms and smartwatches really to improve patient compliance, maybe with lifestyle changes, compliance with exercise and medications.
Yeah, so we're...
And how you might, how you're working in that direction.
So we're working a lot on this in the physical activity space. You and Ashley, who's a heart failure cardiologist at our place, is leading a lot of that activity. We're starting to do, we're getting ready to publish about a 2,200 patient randomized trial of utilizing the watch and the phone in its accelerometer function to nudge people to walk more, to get their steps in. And it turns out that there are ways that people respond to that will up their walk step by 300, 400, 500 steps a day, which every little bit helps. So yeah, there are ways to do it. You got to work with people who understand things like behavioral psychology and how you might, structure certain questions. We just actually also made publicly available all the My Heart Counts data. If you search Ewan's name in PLOS, you can see how to get access to that data. If you want to begin to look at it from a hypothesis-generating perspective, it's out there for the community to use. Yeah.